take us to our next subtopic, which is the end of the campaign and last-minute breaks for Senator Kennedy. Senator Kennedy is going to get 2 last-minute breaks that probably make the difference in him winning this election. Okay? So, the end of the campaign and last-minute breaks for Senator Kennedy. Okay, when I talk about the end of the campaign, what I mean is where the candidates ended their campaign. Nixon ended his presidential campaign in Michigan. And this was after a grueling trip to Alaska. So he hurried up to Alaska, came back to Michigan, and gave his final speech as a candidate in Michigan. Why did he go to Alaska? Why did he hurry that trip to Alaska? He promised to go to all 50 states, and he ended his presidential campaign in Michigan after a grueling trip to Alaska, which completed his 50-state promise. Okay? So he had traveled over 65,000 miles during the campaign. He reached every single state in the Union and would give his final speech in Detroit, Michigan. His final speech as candidate before people went to the polls. So again, Nixon ended his presidential campaign in Michigan after a grueling trip to Alaska, completing his 50-state promise. Nixon had traveled over 65,000 miles during this presidential campaign, and he gave his final speech in Detroit, Michigan. Now this is another example of Kennedy and how well he was handled as far as doing the right things. Kennedy ended his campaign in Massachusetts, his home state, and he gave his final speech at Boston Garden. Now there's a significance behind that. Okay, he finishes the campaign in Massachusetts, his home state, and gives his final speech as a candidate at Boston Garden. Anybody know anything about Boston Garden? You basketball players, any in here? You should know about Boston Garden. That's where the Celtics play. And what was happening with the Celtics in the early 1960s? They were winning every NBA championship possible. They won I don't know how many, 11 out of 12 in the 50s and 60s. They were an unbelievable dynasty. So where would be a better place to give your final speech than Boston Garden, where winners perform? Seriously, he was not a fool. Okay, so he gave his final speech in Boston Garden. He actually traveled, he being Kennedy, over 100,000 miles during the campaign. Now, did he get to all 50 states? No, but he traveled considerably farther than Nixon, despite the fact that he did not hit all 50 states. Now, at the end of the campaign, the Kennedy camp gets 2 major breaks, and these might make the difference in the election, as close as this election turns out to be. The first one not so big as the second, but we mentioned it. The break Kennedy got is Richard Nixon failed to use who during the campaign? Eisenhower. Okay, that was a huge mistake. He failed to utilize the services of President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower would have gone out and campaigned for him down the stretch when it mattered, when people were still trying to make up their mind. And Nixon saw that as grandstanding and thought he needed to do this on his own, not on the coattails of the man he served 8 years as vice president for. That really was a bad move, because historians say if Eisenhower gets out there and campaigns for Nixon down the stretch, as close as the election turned out to be, might have made a difference. Really might have made a difference. The second break that Kennedy got was an interesting story. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia for his stand on civil rights. You're thinking, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I'll explain. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia for his stand on civil rights. Now, this was a time where they would arrest a black man for just about anything that was protesting. And they actually arrested him and they charged him and sentenced him to 6 months in jail at the Georgia State Penitentiary. So Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia for his stand on civil rights. He was then charged and sentenced to 6 months in jail at the Georgia State Penitentiary. Now this penitentiary was hundreds of miles from Atlanta. Matter of fact, it was in the middle of like nowhere, okay? So what would be the concern of Dr. King and his family as he was being sentenced to 6 months in the federal penitentiary in Georgia? Would you want your husband, who many white people hate, to be sentenced to 6 months in prison? What would be your fear? They'd not get out. You might get killed. Okay? And so this is where Kennedy gets the break. So I want you to take out your handout I gave you. It's from the book If Kennedy Lived, pages 14 through 17. And we're going to read this together, because this is a key deal for this election. Okay? So you should have a handout. You've got two, but the first one should say, If Kennedy Lived, Jeff Greenfield, pages 14 through 17. We're going to read this. And I want you to really concentrate on what's being said here. Okay, are you ready? This is quite a story. Everybody got them out? I handed those to you guys before you left. Well, let's listen up here. Here we go. Listen to this if you don't have it. The Republican Party was a serious contender for the Negro vote. Republicans were some of the strongest civil rights champions in the Congress, while Democratic powers like Russell of Georgia, Byrd of Virginia, and Eastland of Mississippi were the latest in a century-long line of Democrats determined to keep blacks in a state of near bondage and peonage. The Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, had so impressed Martin Luther King Jr. with his commitment to equality that most of King's associates were betting that he'd endorse Nixon for president. In fact, Martin Luther King Sr., that would be his father obviously, the young Reverend's father and one of the most influential black ministers in America, had signed a newspaper ad endorsing Nixon out of fear of a Catholic in the White House. Imagine Martin Luther King having a bigot for a father, Kennedy said to campaign aide Harris Woodford, then grinning, well, we all have fathers, don't we? Think about that. This is what Kennedy said. Imagine Martin Luther King having a bigot for a father, Kennedy said to campaign aide Harris Woodford. What does he mean by that? He's a bigot because he is discriminating against who? A Negro man who is complaining about how Negroes are treated and how they're discriminated against is discriminating against Kennedy because he's Catholic. But then he says, grinning, well, we all have fathers, don't we? What's he mean by that? Come on, you guys that don't agree with your parents. Well, Kennedy's not blaming Martin Luther King Jr. for it. He's saying, we all have fathers. You ever follow this LeVar Ball, whose son Alonzo Ball plays for the Lakers? I mean, it's a perfect example of you cannot hold against a kid what their parent does. Okay? You've all been athletes. Your parents certainly sometimes want you to be more successful than you do. I mean, we've all faced that. And what Kennedy's saying is, well, I'm not going to hold against Martin Luther King Jr. for what his father says, because we all have fathers, because his father was a little bit demanding, was he not? And pushy. Well, moving on, then on October 19th, King was arrested at an Atlanta sit-in for trespassing, spending the night in jail for the first time in his life. When he appeared a few days later before a militant segregationist judge, he found himself charged with a trumped-up parole violation and sentenced to 6 months in jail at the Georgia State Penitentiary at Reidsville, hundreds of miles from Atlanta. His wife feared he would never come out of there alive. She called Woodford, who in turn pressured Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy's brother-in-law, who, after carefully making sure that none of the candidates' top aides were within hearing range, persuaded Kennedy to call Mrs. King to express his concern. The reaction within the campaign was explosive. Bobby was so furious that he phoned Shriver and tore into him with such vehemence that it opened up a years-long rift between the two. Summoning Woodford and Lewis Martin, the top Negro of the campaign, he said, "Do you know that 3 Southern governors told us that if Jack supported Jimmy Hoffa, Nikita Khrushchev, or Martin Luther King, they would throw their state to Nixon? Do you know that this election may be razor close and you probably lost it for us? Bobby Kennedy thought John Kennedy calling Mrs. King would lose them the election. What Bobby didn't tell them was that on the advice of the Secretary of the Georgia Democratic Party, he had already called the judge who had thrown King in prison and urged him to release the minister on bond. Along with pressure from the governor, the judge did exactly that, and that's when King's father stepped front and center. He didn't just officially endorse Kennedy, he did much more. I had expected to vote against Senator Kennedy because of his religion, Daddy King said, but now he can be my president, Catholic or whatever he is. It took courage to call my daughter-in-law at a time like this. He had the moral courage to stand up for what he knows is right. I've got all my votes and I've got a suitcase and I'm going to take them up there and dump them in his lap. Almost immediately, Lewis Martin began calling black journalists around the country. He avoided the white press. Papers like the Pittsburgh Courier and Washington Afro-American prominently featured the story. For its part, the campaign distributed some 2 million pamphlets under the name of the Freedom Crusade Committee, and the headline, "No Comment, Nixon versus a Candidate with Heart, Senator Kennedy." For Nixon, the frustration must have been palatable. He urged the Justice Department to intervene, only to be told that it was a matter for the state of Georgia to resolve. It was impossible to prove the impact of those phone calls or Daddy King's statement or the mass distribution of that pamphlet in black neighborhoods across the country. The analytical tools of 1960 weren't that sophisticated. But here's what was known. In a black enclave in Philadelphia, where Stevens had won about 75% of the vote, Kennedy won almost 85%. He topped Stevenson from the previous elections by 10%. In a black neighborhood in Pittsburgh, where Stevenson had won 2-1, Kennedy won 4-1. In New York's most heavily black neighborhoods, Stevenson had won 2/3 of the vote. Kennedy won 3/4 of the vote. In New Jersey, some 125,000 blacks had voted for JFK. He won the state by 30,000 votes, a margin of less than 1%. As for Illinois, where Kennedy won by 8,000 highly dubious votes, one aide noted, "Without the Negroes, it wouldn't have been close enough to steal. Not that I'm saying we stole it." Even in the South, the black vote was critical. For all the talk of LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, as the key to Texas, the black vote in Houston, which had given Stevenson 12,000 votes, gave Kennedy more than 22,300. And the Negro vote in Louisiana and the Carolinas was crucial to Kennedy's narrow victories there. The link between those phone calls and his historically close victory was not obvious, but there were times when he allowed himself to think. If he had not called Coretta Scott King, if his brother had not called the judge, if Daddy King had not expressed his gratitude so powerfully, if the black vote had not come out as enthusiastically as it did, then Richard Nixon would have likely won the White House. And what would a President Nixon have done if he had confronted with offensive missiles in Cuba? It had taken every ounce of presidential assistance to keep Kennedy's advisors, military and civilian, from launching an airstrike with God knows what consequences. With a Nixon in the White House, incredible that Kennedy's presidency and the fate of the world might have hinged on a couple of telephone calls. Then again, it might also have hinged on how his wife had been feeling on a Sunday almost 3 years ago, which leads to more stories. Do you understand the impact that that phone call made and the one Bobby made? Sergeant Shriver tried for a long time to get Senator Kennedy to call Coretta Scott King. It finally came to Sergeant Shriver picking up the phone, dialing the number, and putting the phone in Kennedy's ear. That's what it came to. And that, along with Bobby Kennedy's call, made the entire difference. I believe kept Richard Nixon out of the White House. How frustrated must he have been? He thought he had it cinched with the Negro vote, right? His father, Martin Luther King's father, had already pretty much publicly said, "We're going with Nixon." Changed his mind. All of a sudden, all kinds of African Americans go to the polls, and who do they vote for? John Kennedy. And you caught that in some of these states it made the difference in winning those electoral votes or not. And when you see the final result here, you'll understand the impact it made. So anyway, that's a very, very important thing. I don't have you any assignment on that. I just want you to understand the impact that that particular instance made in our country's history. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is the final result of the campaign of 1960. This is pretty interesting. I'm going to write some numbers down here. You can write them down if you want. We won't hammer you on the test on these, but I want you to know them. Okay, according to the 1960 census, they figured that the population of the United States was about 180 million people. That's what they estimated. And of these 180 million people, they figured there 18 million were Negroes. And what do you think the other 40 million were that would be significant in Kennedy's favor? What were those? What? Catholics. Okay? So this is kind of the statistics prior to the election of 1960. About 180 million people lived in the United States. Of that 180, 18 million people were Negroes and about 40 million were of the Roman Catholic religion. Now, the result of the election of 1960 would be the second closest presidential election in American history. Only the election of 1880 would be closer when James Garfield defeated Winfield Hancock by just 2,018 popular votes and by only 59 electoral votes. This would be the second closest election since James Garfield was elected president right here. Okay? Now obviously, kiddos, were there 180 million people voting? No, that was the population. So let's take a look at the voters here. Let's take a look at the voters and see what happened here. Okay, 68,450,990 people voted in the election of 1960. Okay, one of the highest voter turnouts in American history. 68,450,990. Now, do you remember how many candidates we got running here? 3, remember? Remember Senator Byrd was running? He got 116,248. Byrd did. Okay? Nixon got 34,107,646. Senator Kennedy received 34,227,096. In other words, Kennedy defeated Nixon by only 119,450 votes out of 68 million. He defeated him by 119,450, which I'm going to write down the percent on that. You tell me what it is, you mathematician wizards. Here's the percent that he wins in the popular vote. 0.007, oh, excuse me, 0.0017 4801274. What's that percentage? Anybody know math majors there? Is that about 1/5 of 1%? Is that about right? That's an incredibly close race. And, you know, after this last election, you're thinking, well, gee whiz, that's no big deal. Hillary Clinton defeated Trump in the popular vote. At this time, that was very unusual. Okay? So that was a very, very close election here. But we all know that popular votes and 50 cents will buy you a pop. They don't matter. It's the Electoral College. Now, in this particular election, the winner had to get 269 electoral votes to win. 269. There were 537 possible. You had to get 269 to win. 269 to win out of 537. When the election concluded, Senator Kennedy received 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. 303 for Kennedy, 219 for Nixon. Now, does that add up to 537? No, we're 15 short. Who got the other 15? Senator Byrd of Virginia. He won the state of Mississippi, surprise. So it was an incredibly close election. So with this victory in the election of 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy becomes the 35th President of the United States, the youngest man ever elected President of the United States, and the only man of the Catholic religion ever elected President of the United States. So again, with his victory in the election of 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy becomes the 35th President of the United States, the youngest man ever elected President of the United States, and the only man of the Roman Catholic religion ever elected President of the United States. Any questions on that? And does that happen without the 2 breaks he gets at the end? Probably not. If Eisenhower goes out and campaigns down the stretch, and if the Negro vote goes to Nixon, we're not talking about anything about John F. Kennedy. Okay? All right, well that'll take us to our last subtopic of the day, which I'm going to give you a profile on John Fitzgerald Kennedy prior to 1960, because we're going to talk a lot about him from that point on. Profile on John Fitzgerald Kennedy prior to 1960. Now I'm going to lecture about 5 minutes here or so, and then I'm going to talk about these JFK files that you're hearing about and what that amounts to. Okay? Well, John F. Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. That would be B-R-O-O-K-L-I-N-E. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts on May 29, 1917. John F. Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts on May 29, 1917. On May 29, 2017, on what it would have been his 100th birthday, the new commemorative stand